A U.S. Marine Corps F-35B went missing last weekend after its pilot ejected over South Carolina. And in the more than 24 hours it took to locate the missing jet's debris, countless conspiracy theories took root. Did artificial intelligence take control and eject the pilot? Did Russian hackers take control and fly the jet to Cuba? Was it sheer incompetence that led the US military to lose track of a $100 million jet? No, guys, the answer to all these questions is no. I was ready to put this story to bed after the debris was found, but since the conspiracy theories are still dominating social media, let's address them. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Over the past week, the world's crazy uncles, you know those guys who were always just asking questions, have had a field day with this story about a US Marine Corps F-35B going missing after its pilot ejected over South Carolina. And I want to be clear up front that there's an investigation underway, and right now the details we have about exactly what happened last Sunday are still pretty sparse. And in that absence of confirmed official information, we all know how much the internet likes to use its imagination to fill in the gaps. But I'm not a big fan of using my imagination to decide how real events took place, so I set out to find real answers to the questions it seems so many people were asking rhetorically, as though just asking these questions is somehow proof in itself of a broader conspiracy. Now, as a part of this effort, I spoke to a number of fighter pilots, some of whom fly the F-35 itself. Now, because these pilots are still actively affiliated with the military, they asked that I not use their answers on the record, and I won't, but I'm not going to just ask you to trust me about this. Instead, I used their responses to help guide me toward better references so I could more adequately dispel these conspiracy theories without asking you to just trust me that I talked to a guy. Now, the reason I tell you that is because as I researched this story, I found that even I had some misconceptions that I needed to dispel. And the truth is, despite my efforts to know a great deal about military aviation, I obviously don't know everything, and I'm just as capable of being wrong as anyone else. I am extremely fortunate to have sources that I can reach out to ask questions like this, and while I can't name them, I hope that they're watching and understand how grateful I am. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's start with what we know. Last Sunday, 2 U.S. Marine Corps F-35Bs hailing from the Marine Fighter Attack Training Squadron 501, or the Warlords out of the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing, departed from Joint Base Charleston in what's been described as a routine training flight by 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing spokesperson Captain Joe Leitner. Now, these aircraft were flying in a stealth profile, and that is to say that they did not have radar reflectors or Lunenburg lenses installed. That's going to matter later in this story. At right around 2 p.m. Eastern Time, one of the 2 pilots was forced to eject from the aircraft while operating not far from the Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion areas near Charleston, South Carolina. After ejecting, the pilot parachuted to safety in a residential neighborhood in Charleston, and according to reports, the aircraft's transponder was not functioning at the time, which some media outlets and myself assumed meant that there was some sort of malfunction. But I now understand that the truth is there's a good reason why its transponder was likely not online, and we'll discuss that here in just a bit. The pilot was immediately taken to a local hospital for evaluation where he was soon listed as stable. According to an allegedly recorded phone call to the Charleston County Emergency Medical Services that was later posted online by a local meteorologist, bad weather may have played a role in this mishap. In the recording, you can hear someone say he's unsure of where his plane crashed, said he just lost it in the weather. Now, this recording hasn't been confirmed by officials, and it is worth noting that the weather in Charleston, South Carolina at the time of the ejection was listed as 87 degrees and sunny. It seems more likely that he lost it in the weather quote, if real, might just mean that he couldn't see where the aircraft went because it flew through clouds. A search effort immediately ensued in the vicinity of Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion, where more than 160,000 acres of lake are surrounded by sprawling expanses of swamps, campgrounds, and rural woods. Not long after 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Joint Base Charleston turned to social media to announce the pilot's safe ejection and to request help locating the lost F-35. And that's where a whole lot of people got mad. This anger and frustration was perhaps best expressed by Republican Representative Nancy Mace, who wrote on Twitter, "How in the hell do you lose an F-35? How is there not a tracking device? And we're asking the public to what? Find a jet and turn it in?" It wasn't until after 5 p.m. the next day that officials announced that they had located debris from the crash in a rural stretch of Williamsburg County, South Carolina, some 60 miles from the ejection site. The biggest question people kept asking during the search and after was, how does the DoD lose a $100 million aircraft? And when I say 100 million, I mean it. I know a lot of media outlets reported it as an $80 million aircraft. That's the sticker price for an F-35A. We're talking about a short takeoff, vertical landing F-35B, which rings in at around 101.3 million. Now, for those who are well versed in military aviation, the answer to this question is actually pretty intuitive, but for those who aren't, explaining it can be somewhat complicated. So we're going to start pretty high level and then get a bit more specific as we go, but I'll give you the bottom line up front. There are only two ways to track an aircraft mid-flight. The first is from the aircraft actively broadcasting a signal from a device called a transponder. And the second is by the aircraft reflecting a signal that's broadcast at it. We call that radar. Now, the F-35 was purposely designed not to reflect those radar signals, making it exceedingly difficult to detect and track from that method, leaving only the transponder. So let's talk about that transponder for a minute before we get back to radar. It doesn't matter if we're talking about an F-35 or a 747, they all use transponders as their primary means of tracking. Now, transponders are basically just electronic devices that transmit a unique code, sometimes called a squawk code, to air traffic control assets like ground radar stations and even some satellites when they're pinged to do so. Now, transponders broadcast all kinds of useful information, like the specific aircraft identification, its airspeed, altitude, and direction of travel. And that all makes them essential for safely managing the 100,000 or more flights per day that take place over just the continental United States. In military aircraft, transponders also play an essential role in the military's identification friend or foe, or IFF system, which is used to deconflict complex airspace. In other words, when pinged, these transponder signals will respond with data that makes it easy to differentiate the good guys from the bad guys in the air. Now, when this F-35's disappearance was first announced, defense officials said that at the time of the ejection, the aircraft's transponder was not functioning for unknown reasons. And this led many, including me, to believe that they were referencing some sort of malfunction. Now, a malfunction of the transponder could have been tied to a larger system failure that ultimately forced the pilot to eject, and that's not that far-fetched. But the truth is, that transponder was probably turned off to begin with, and for good reason. And you can find that good reason in the Federal Aviation Administration's Aeronautical Information Manual, or AIM, on paragraph 4-1-20. I'll go ahead and just read it to you. When participating in VFR standard formation flight that is not receiving ATC services, only the lead aircraft should operate its transponder and ADS-B out in squawk code 1203. Once established in formation, all other aircraft should squawk standby and disable ADS-B transmissions. Don't worry, I'm going to translate that into something that'll make sense. When aircraft are flying in formation, only the lead aircraft is supposed to have its transponder broadcasting. Now, this is because transponders respond to a ping that's sent from a ground station. And if all aircraft in formation have their transponders online, in close proximity to one another, they'll all be pinged at the same time, and they'll all broadcast their response at the same time. Now, that would result in all of the signals reaching the ground receiver at once and could potentially garble their transmissions. So, in order to prevent that, only the lead aircraft in the formation leaves their transponder squawking, as they call it. Assuming the lost F-35 was not the lead aircraft in this two-fighter formation, it would be perfectly appropriate for their transponder to be offline. Of course, even if the missing F-35 was the lead jet, it's still possible that the transponder was malfunctioning due to the same system failure that forced the ejection, or even that the ejection itself may have damaged the transponder system. But to be honest, these both seem less likely to me than the idea that the transponder was just not online and the pilot neglected to turn it on prior to ejecting. Alright, so now we know that there was pretty good reason for the transponder to likely be offline, and we couldn't use that to track this aircraft after ejection. So the next question is, why couldn't the US military track this aircraft on radar? And that question befuddles me. The very reason this aircraft is so expensive is because the United States dumped tons of resources into making the F-35 exceedingly difficult to detect, track, and target. And yet, somehow, we're now mad that it turned out to be really difficult to detect, track, and target. Of course, that isn't to say that it's impossible to detect or track stealth fighters like the F-35 on radar. We've even discussed several methods in the past. One of the most common and reliable is using radar reflectors that we usually call Lunenburg lenses. Now, these lenses are installed on the aircraft on the ground, and they produce such a prominent radar return that it makes these jets very easy to detect and track. Now, this is really handy for safety reasons, but also to hide the aircraft's actual radar signature when transiting international airspace, for instance, so that adversary nations can't collect data on its actual stealth profile. Now, I want to highlight that these lenses are installed and removed on the ground because many of the crazier conspiracy theories about AI or Chinese hackers taking control of the aircraft and putting it into, quote, stealth mode totally ignore the fact that stealth mode isn't a switch that you flip. Putting the F-35 in a stealth profile is something that requires actual human interaction with the airframe itself on the ground. Now, the other way that people can sometimes detect and track stealth fighters is the resonance that they can sometimes produce against low-frequency radar arrays, like those used by some air traffic control towers, weather tracking stations, and some early warning air defenses. Now, we have an entire video delving into how this happens and what it means for stealth fighters, but in a nutshell, some of the design elements that are required for the aerobatic performance of a fighter, things like its big gaping jet inlets and its standing vertical tail surfaces, can sometimes produce this resonance that can be detected by low-frequency radar arrays, but these radar arrays can't produce what we call a weapons-grade lock. They don't have the image fidelity to actually guide a weapon into a target. All they can really do is tell you, hey, there might be a stealth fighter in that direction. But the truth is, while some nations like to brag about occasionally detecting these low-frequency resonances, doing so reliably is another story entirely. Producing a resonance that can be detected by these low-frequency radar arrays depends on a ton of variables, like angle of observation, atmospheric conditions, altitude, and even more. So even if you have a low-frequency array pointed in the right direction, detecting the resonance created by a stealth fighter is not a sure thing. So one more time, stealth fighters are designed specifically to be very difficult to detect and track on radar, so we shouldn't be surprised when it turns out they are. But I get the sense that lawmakers like Nancy Mace and folks who have shared similar concerns aren't just talking about radar. They're wondering why we don't have some other means, maybe even some more exotic means, of tracking some of America's most expensive and capable military platforms. So let's try to address that in a more general sense. First of all, if it sort of freaks you out to think that the United States has highly trained F-35 pilots flying around in aircraft that we have trouble keeping active tabs on, you'll have an absolute anxiety attack when you find out how America's nuclear ballistic missile submarines operate. America's Ohio-class subs carry so much nuclear firepower on board that each individual sub could be classified as one of the world's top 10 nuclear powers. And yet, because radio transmissions don't penetrate seawater very effectively, we could find ourselves reliant on Takamo aircraft circling over the open ocean with a 2-mile antenna hanging out the back, trying to relay a message to these subs to tell them to end the world. Submariners really are alone and unafraid out there. Of course, fighters flying through the air can receive and transmit radio signals far more easily, but stealth aircraft like the F-35 take great pains for what we often call electromagnetic discipline. In other words, the signals transmitted by these aircraft and the procedures that we train their pilots to adhere to are all about making sure that no errant signal could potentially tip off an adversary as to their presence or specific location. And even if we could design and field a system today that could securely transmit the exact location of every F-35 back to the United States, by the time we got it installed in all of the more than 1,000 F-35s that have been delivered already, there's a solid chance that adversary nations like China may have already found the means to leverage that system to do us harm. Throughout more than 600,000 accumulated flight hours, this problem has only happened once, so creating that significant a vulnerability just isn't really worth it to solve this problem that seems to be exceedingly rare. And while we're on that topic, let's address the theories that this aircraft could have been hacked and taken over, ejecting the pilot without the pilot's consent so that the aircraft could be flown to Cuba or whatever. Now, these theories are built upon very real statements and legitimate concerns about the F-35's vulnerabilities to cyber attacks and even hacking. But the truth is, while these concerns are legitimate, none of them are about the aircraft being taken over. Now, every conspiracy theory peddling article I've seen online almost unanimously cite a 2018 report from the Government Accountability Office when they talk about this hacking vulnerability. Now, this report was called Weapon Systems Cybersecurity, DoD Just Beginning to Grapple with the Scale of Vulnerabilities. And of course, despite citing this report as substantiation for this hacking theory, articles like this one from the Daily Mail don't even include a link to the actual report, and that's probably because the report itself does not substantiate this theory at all. In fact, in the entirety of the 50-page report, the F-35 isn't even mentioned by name once. Now, that isn't to say that there are no cyber vulnerabilities in the F-35 program. It's just important to understand the nuanced reality of how those threats manifest. There really are two primary avenues that a hacker might use to gain access to the F-35's onboard systems. One of them was in use at the time of this report but has since been replaced, and that's the Automatic Logistics Information System, or ALIS. Now, ALIS is a logistics support system that tracks aircraft use, issues, maintenance requirements, and the like to allow for rapid logistics and maintenance support. Hacking into this system could certainly cause some big problems, but not the sort that would make a pilot eject. Instead, hackers could have the aircraft indicate that it needs some unscheduled maintenance, or they could gunk up logistical scheduling to reduce readiness rates across the fleet. Now, those problems are nothing to scoff at, but it's not going to allow hackers to remote control pilot an F-35 all the way to Cuba. Now, starting last year, the ALIS system has been phased out and it's being replaced by the Operational Data Integrated Network, or ODIN, Logistical Information System. Now, again, that's not to say that ODIN is forever hack-proof, but the faults found in ALIS are no longer a concern. And again, hacking ODIN, if you could do it, would more likely result in headaches than ejections. Now, the other potential avenue for hacking is the Joint Reprogramming Enterprise, or JRE system, which is used primarily for mission planning and to provide important situational awareness to pilots in combat. Now, the JRE really is an incredible system that sort of video gamifies a lot of elements of combat operations and mission planning. Among other things, it maintains a constantly updated library of adversary weapon systems, capabilities, and other threat information. To give you one very simple example of how this system could be leveraged in combat, let's say an F-35 pilot is going to engage a target that's protected by a Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile system. Once that threat's been identified by the aircraft's onboard sensors, the JRE can pull up vital information like the platform's targeting envelope for the F-35, or how close that F-35 can fly to the S-400 without being actively targeted. And this can allow pilots to avoid unnecessary risks as they traverse the modern battlefield. Now again, hacking this system could certainly create some really big problems, like telling a pilot that they can fly much closer to that S-400 than they actually can. And if a pilot were misled by such a hacker, they might fly their aircraft right into a very dangerous situation, resulting in them being shot down. But again, gaining access to this system is a far cry from gaining control of the aircraft. Even F-35 pilots physically in the cockpit are required to enter a personal identification PIN followed by specified mission authorization codes in order to gain access to the flight controls that they're physically touching. You're just not likely to breach that sort of security from your laptop using McDonald's Wi-Fi in South Carolina. Now, I do want to qualify that statement with the fact that in the world of cybersecurity, it's tough to say anything is impossible. But we're talking about an F-35 flying over the continental United States and hailing from a training command, which means in an aviation mishap like this, the most likely culprits would obviously be a system failure or malfunction or good old-fashioned human error. And on that note, let's wrap up with one more conspiracy theory that the truth is there could be something to, but not in the way most people are saying. Could the pilot have been ejected by the aircraft's onboard computers? Now, this theory usually comes along with people claiming that AI took control of the aircraft and kicked the pilot out, which is so exceedingly unlikely that it verges on impossibility. But it is possible that the pilot was ejected without making the decision to pull the lever. Because of the unique dangers inherent to the way the F-35B can hover and land vertically, it's the only variant of the Joint Strike Fighter to come with an auto-ejection system that's linked to the Martin Baker US-16E type ejection seat in the cockpit. Because the F-35 has only one turbofan engine on board, and the lifting fan behind the cockpit is actually connected to that engine via a drive shaft, an engine failure could result in the aircraft's nose rapidly pitching down, causing the aircraft to effectively flip. And if that happens, pilots may not have the chance to eject in time. So this system was designed to eject the pilot the instant it recognizes that's what's happening. Now, details about this system are extremely limited, and it's possible that it may only actually function when the aircraft is hovering, but then it's also possible that this aircraft was hovering at the time the pilot ejected. But to tell you the truth, I think that's unlikely. This system was designed to save pilots in the event of an engine failure, and if the engine was failing, it's pretty unlikely this aircraft would have gone on to fly for another 60 miles thereafter. I'm not saying it's impossible, it just seems a lot more likely that the pilot chose to eject for a reason that hasn't been disclosed yet. And to that same end, the fact that this F-35 flew for another 60 miles after the ejection is also not at all a sign that it was hacked or taken over by AI. Fighters in particular continuing to fly for tens or even hundreds of miles after their pilots eject has happened more than once and since well before flight control computers were even a thing. In 1970, for instance, an F-106 Delta Dart went into a flat spin that eventually forced its pilot to eject, but thanks to the shift in weight from getting rid of the pilot and ejection seat and cockpit canopy, the aircraft went into a dive and then leveled off and flew on for another 50 miles before coming to a pretty gentle belly landing in a cornfield in Montana. In 1983, a similar situation saw a Soviet MiG-23 pilot eject, and the MiG-23 flew for another 500 miles before ultimately crashing into a house in Belgium and killing a person inside. But even if this was prone to happen before, it's even more likely to happen now in aircraft like the F-16 and F-35 specifically, thanks to Lockheed Martin's automatic ground collision avoidance system. Now, this system was designed to take control of the aircraft just before it hits the ground in the event a pilot loses consciousness. And according to Lockheed Martin, it's already saved 9 pilots' lives. Here's how they explain it. The system consists of a set of complex collision avoidance and autonomous decision-making algorithms that utilize precise navigation, aircraft performance, and onboard digital terrain data to determine if a ground collision is imminent. If the system predicts an imminent collision, an autonomous avoidance maneuver, a roll to wings level, and a 5G pull is commanded at the last instance to prevent ground impact. Now, a lot of folks have very logically reasoned that the aircraft may have kept flying for another 60 miles because its autopilot was engaged at the time of the ejection, but some of the F-35 pilots that I spoke to said it was far more likely that the ground collision avoidance system is what kept it limping along. One of them described it as simply not allowing the aircraft to crash. Ultimately, we won't know the answers to a lot of our questions until the investigation has been completed and its findings have been released. But the truth is, there is a chance that some answers may never be forthcoming, because ultimately, the military is more concerned with ensuring the safety of its aviators and the capability of its platforms than it is with debunking some of the crazier conspiracy theories associated with one of these mishaps. At the end of the day, if it comes down to choosing between answering the internet's burning questions and maintaining operational security, the Pentagon is always going to pick operational security. And the truth is, just as we saw after the debris was found, even when information is forthcoming, people who don't want to hear it will just dismiss it because it's coming from the government. I can't tell you how many messages and comments I got this week saying that the government announcing that they found the debris of this wrecked aircraft proves that they were covering something up. I'm not sure then what the government was supposed to do when they found this debris, but this seems like evidence that those who want to find conspiracies always will, regardless of the evidence at hand. But for those of you who came with real questions and an open mind, I hope that I was able to put at least some of them to bed for you. And if you have more than I didn't address, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to get to them too. But until then, so ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.